So how can we now protect against cross-site scripting attacks? Well, to protect against those attacks, we got two main building blocks that you should be aware of. The first very important building block is that you should try to output escaped user content. So if you're outputting user content somewhere on your page, you should not take the raw HTML code and parse it as such, or hand it to the browser to parse it as such. Instead, you should escape it. And escaping the content simply means that certain features of HTML will be disabled, or the entire HTML block will actually be treated as raw text instead of HTML. So you might have all the HTML tags in there, but instead of handing them to the browser for the browser to parse them, you might output them as plain text and not let the browser parse them. And then the script tag, which I entered before, would be output as plain text on the screen instead of being executed by the browser. I will show you how you can escape user input in just a second, but that's the first building block. The second building block, which would be an alternative, is that you sanitize, that you clean the user input before you process or store it. Now, if you do escape the output, which I'll show you in a second, you don't need to sanitize and clean because escaping is enough protection. If you do output raw, unescaped content though, then you should really try to sanitize it first so that you do ensure that you don't work with raw user input, but instead it was cleaned first. Because sanitizing means that you take a look at that user-generated content and you look for certain suspicious things, like script tags, and you then remove those script tags or you convert them to something that can't do any harm. So sanitizing is important if you plan to output unescaped user input. If you do escape, you don't need it. But we're going to take a look at both, and therefore let's start by taking a look at escaping user input when we output it on a page. But let's start with the first one, with escaping the content. So that instead of injecting a script like this into the rendered template, we actually just output it as plain text. And that is possible. Back here on the backend, where we have this injected content in the database right now, we can go to the discussion EJS file. And here there is something wrong with how I'm outputting this comment text. I'm using this EJS tag with a dash here after the EJS opening tag. Now, it's been some time since I introduced you to the EJS templating language, but you might recall that we typically output text and so on with the equal sign instead of the dash here. The reason for that is that when you use this EJS tag with the equal sign, the content that will be output will be escaped. It will be treated as plain text in the end. And therefore you should always use this equal sign instead of the dash when outputting user-generated content, unless you really know that you must parse it as actual HTML content. And in that case, you should have made sure that it was sanitized first. But typically you want to use this tag with the equal sign, and that is the tag we used throughout this course therefore. The tag with the dash can, for example, be seen when we use the include function, because there indeed I'm about to include a bunch of HTML code that's defined in a different file, and it should be parsed and used as HTML here. But here I'm including HTML code which I, the developer, wrote. Therefore it's safe. It's not user-generated content. User-generated content instead should typically be output like this, with the equal sign tag. So if you save this now and reload this page, now you see this as plain text and you didn't get that alert. And if we inspect this in the developer tools, we indeed see here it still looks like HTML, but it was passed to the browser as plain text and not as HTML. So therefore, actually here the browser did not execute this script, because to the browser it's just a regular text, and hence now we have this injected code, but it's not doing anything bad. And that therefore is something you should do. Always output user-generated content with that equal sign tag here, or with any other technique that escapes the content. If you're using a different templating engine, all those engines typically have escape tags, and you should always escape that user-generated content before you output it. Now that was escaping. Before I mentioned that an alternative to that would be to sanitize the user input. Again, you don't need to do both, and typically you shouldn't sanitize. You should instead prioritize escaping, but it is worth knowing about sanitizing as well, especially if you have scenarios where you can't escape, but where you need to output some raw HTML content, and where you need to parse it as HTML. In such cases, you might at least consider sanitizing it before you output it. Now, sanitizing means cleaning, as I mentioned before. It means that you take a look at that content and you get rid of any dangerous things in that content. And whilst you could write your own code, which takes a look at the user content and tries to clean it, very often it's more convenient to instead use third-party packages again. For Express.js, if you search for Express Sanitize User Input, you will find discussions that share different approaches that can be used and different packages that can be used. And you will also find packages themselves, like the Express Validator package, which can also be used for general input validation. So that's also a package you might want to take a look at. Now, for cross-site scripting attacks specifically, you can also search for Express XSS. You will also find more information on how you can add cross-site scripting protection in your Express app. And for example, this XSS package here could be used for that. This is a package which you can install into any Node.js project. And there you can use it to take some input, for example, some user input which you received in one of your routes, and let the package parse and convert it into a safe alternative. So this package will then strip certain content, like for example, such script tags. Now, to use this package in our project, we can stop the server and npm install XSS, so install this package. And then in the routes, for example, we can import this package here by requiring it, as we always do. And then in the post route, where we receive content that might be malicious, so where we receive user-generated content that we plan on outputting on the page, there we can actually wrap this with a function call. So we pass request body comment to this XSS function, and this function will then sanitize and clean it and return the cleaned value. And it's then the cleaned, sanitized value that is stored here in the database. So if we now start this server again, and I go to the MongoDB shell, if I have a look at my comments, I see this one comment here, which we added before, with the script in there. But if I now go back to my main page, and I reload and try to do the same thing again, so I try to add another script where I say hacked again, you'll see a different result now. If I click send, we see a different output here, and we see a different output here because the user input was translated to this output here. The script tag was basically replaced with a non-HTML version of that content. If we have a look at the database, we also see that this data was stored like that in the database. Now, in case you're wondering what this and-lt and and-gt means, these are special character descriptions, you could say, in HTML, where and-lt semicolon stands for the lower than sign, and and-gt semicolon stands for the greater than sign. So that is how this was translated. If you would switch back to outputting it as raw HTML again, Then if you reload, you of course get the alert from the first try, but then here you see the second comment which I added, which was sanitized before it was stored. And here the strange LT and GT parts are translated back into lower than and greater than signs, but this overall is not executed as JavaScript, but instead just output as plain text, because it was already transformed from HTML to text in the sanitization step. And now the browser just translates it into a more user-friendly version. But of course here I do escape in addition to sanitizing it, and therefore we output the sanitized version as plain text, and hence we have these ugly LT and GT placeholders here. That's why you typically shouldn't do both. You should not sanitize and escape. Instead, you should do either of the two, and typically just escaping is preferred, but you should sanitize if you plan on outputting unescaped content, so that you cleaned it first. That's the idea. Here we're doing both because I wanted to show both. Now you can also change the configuration for this XSS package to change how things are getting sanitized. Or, as mentioned before, you check out Express Validator, which is a great alternative, which also offers sanitization, but in addition also offers validation, where you can use a middleware-based approach to validate incoming user data and, for example, check if something is an email and so on. So what we did manually before in the course, this package could also do it for you, and it could also add sanitization in addition. Of course, you could also add logic that, for example, checks if some user input that's about to be saved contains things like script tags and then block that input altogether. It will always depend on how your website should behave and what your overall goal is. But this is sanitization in action, and together with escaping user output, you can now really protect against cross-site scripting attacks, and you can make sure that this code, this malicious JavaScript code, can't be injected into your site.